the alien girl stood alone, until a human gave her a reason to smile. Part 1. Waypoint 11 was never quiet. The massive orbital station hung in the darkness between stars, and every hour brought new ships filled with refugees fleeing the expansion war. Thousands of beings from dozens of species crowded the processing halls, their voices mixing into a constant hum of fear and exhaustion. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and unwashed bodies. Children cried. Adults argued. Medical alarms beeped endlessly in the distance. Had been working at the station for 8 months, and she had learned to move through the chaos without stopping. She was 34 years old, a former emergency room nurse from Earth who had joined the Galactic Relief Coalition after watching news reports of entire planets being evacuated. She had thought she understood suffering before she came here. She had been wrong. Today was like every other day. Stood at Intake Station 7, scanning identification chips and directing refugees to housing blocks. Her feet hurt. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. But she kept her voice gentle and her movements calm, because these people had lost everything, and the least she could do was treat them with kindness. A family passed through her station, the parents carrying 3 small children with gray skin and worried eyes. Behind them came an elderly couple holding hands tightly. Then a group of young males who had probably been students before the war turned them into refugees, processed them all, gave them directions, and wished them luck. The transport from Sector 9 arrived just before her shift was supposed to end. It was a damaged ship, one engine barely functioning, the hull by weapons fire. The survivors who stumbled off looked worse than most. They had been running for weeks, jumping from system to system to escape patrols. Stayed to help with the intake. She was tired, but these people needed assistance, and there were never enough workers at Waypoint 11. She noticed the girl almost immediately. The child stood near the back of the processing line, completely still while everyone around her moved and shuffled and spoke. She was maybe 8 years old by human standards. Her skin was pale blue, almost white under the harsh station lights. Her eyes were large and silver, reflecting nothing. 2 delicate antennae rose from her forehead, lying flat and motionless against her head. Were rare. Had only seen a handful during her time at the station. They were known throughout the galaxy for their extreme sensitivity to emotional environments. They could sense feelings from the beings around them, absorbing joy and pain and fear like sponges absorbing water. In a place like Waypoint 11, filled with thousands of traumatized refugees, a child should have been overwhelmed. But this girl showed nothing. No tears, no fear, no reaction at all. Checked the ship's manifest and found the entry. The girl's name was. Her family had been on a separate transport during the evacuation of their colony. That transport had been destroyed by fighters. There were no other survivors. Had watched the explosion from her own ship's window. She was alone. Approached slowly, keeping her movements gentle. Other aid workers glanced at the girl and quickly looked away. There was something unsettling about her stillness, something that made people uncomfortable. They processed her paperwork and assigned her a housing unit without ever really looking at her. Looked. She crouched down a few feet away from, putting herself at the child's eye level. She did not reach out or speak. She simply stayed there, sharing the space, letting the girl know that someone saw her. Did not respond. Her silver eyes stared at a point somewhere beyond shoulder, seeing nothing in this world. Later that evening, found the station's cultural advisor, a tired-looking academic named Professor who had been trapped at Waypoint 11 when the war cut off travel to his home institution. She asked him about children who went silent after trauma. The professor's face grew sad. He explained that empaths sometimes closed off their abilities when the emotional pain around them became too great. It was a survival mechanism, a way to protect themselves from drowning in the feelings of others. But the closure came at a cost. A who stayed closed for too long could suffer permanent emotional damage. They might never feel anything again. Asked how long was too long. The professor did not have a good answer. Days, perhaps, weeks at most. The girl on the transport had already been silent for nearly 10 days according to her medical records. Returned to the housing block where it had been assigned. The room was small and bare, with a single bed and a tiny window showing the stars outside. Sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the same clothes she had arrived in, still staring at nothing. The other refugees in nearby rooms avoided her door. A closed-off felt wrong to other beings, like a hole in the emotional fabric of a space. It made people uneasy without knowing why. Did not go inside. She sat down in the hallway outside the open door, leaning against the wall, and said nothing. She simply existed nearby, a quiet presence without demands or expectations. She stayed for an hour before her exhaustion forced her to leave. When she stood up, she glanced back at. The girl had not moved, but her antennae had shifted slightly, just a tiny bit, turning in its direction. It was the first response had shown to anyone since her family died. Walked back to her own quarters with a strange feeling in her chest. It was not hope exactly. Hope felt too strong for something so small, but it was something, a possibility, a door that might not be completely closed. She decided she would come back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Humans were stubborn that way. They did not give up easily, especially on children, especially on the ones who seemed most lost. Other species found this trait confusing. Resources were limited. Time was precious. Why waste both on a single damaged child when there were thousands of refugees who needed help? Did not have a good answer for that question. She only knew that she could not walk past the door and pretend the girl did not exist. Someone had to try. It might as well be her. The alien girl stood alone, until a human gave her a reason to smile. Part 2. 3 days passed and kept her promise to herself. Every evening after her shift ended, she walked to the housing block where lived and sat in the hallway outside her door. She never pushed. She never demanded attention. She simply showed up again and again, letting her presence speak for itself. The other aid workers noticed. Danny Vance, the logistics coordinator who managed supply distribution for their sector, pulled aside during lunch on the 4th day. He was a practical man in his late 40s, good at his job and generally kind, but he had seen too many colleagues burn out from caring too much. He told she needed to be careful. The station had thousands of refugees who needed help. Spending hours every day on one child who might never recover was not a good use of her energy. He was not being cruel. He was being realistic. Thanked him for his concern and went back to work. That afternoon, she learned that it had been classified as non-responsive by the medical staff. The classification meant she would be transferred to a specialized facility on a distant station, a place known for sedating difficult patients and keeping them quiet until they either recovered or stopped being a problem. The transfer was scheduled for the end of the week. Found administrator in his office and asked him to delay the transfer. Was a tall and thin with pale yellow skin and eyes that never seemed to blink. He ran waypoint 11 with efficiency as his highest priority. Every refugee was a number to be processed, a problem to be solved, a file to be closed. He listened to his request and it. The child was taking up resources without showing improvement. The specialized facility was better equipped to handle her case. The transfer would proceed as scheduled. Left his office with her jaw tight and her hands clenched at her sides. She went to her room that evening carrying a soft blanket she had traded 2 days of dessert rations to obtain. She did not go inside. She simply folded the blanket and placed it just inside the doorway, then sat down in her usual spot in the hallway. The blanket was still there when she left, but the next morning, one of the medical aides told her that had been seen holding it during the night. Small progress, almost invisible but progress. Began leaving other things. A cup of water placed within easy reach, a packet of nutrient supplements that required no preparation, a small light that glowed softly in the darkness. She never handed these items to directly. She simply made them available and let the girl choose. The refugees in nearby rooms watched these strange rituals with confusion. A gruff merchant named, who had lost his ship and his crew to raiders, stopped one evening to ask what she was doing. Told him she was trying to help. Shook his head slowly. His gray skin was weathered from decades of space travel, and his eyes held the tired wisdom of someone who had seen too much. He told that who closed off their emotions rarely came back. She was wasting her time on a lost cause. Thanked him for his opinion and continued to door. That night she did something different. Instead of sitting in silence, she began to talk. Not to directly, but out loud, as if she were speaking to herself or to the empty hallway. She talked about Earth. She described the ocean, the way the waves rolled in and out with a rhythm that could calm any troubled mind. She talked about rain, the sound of it hitting windows and rooftops, the smell of wet earth after a storm. She talked about her mother's garden, the tomatoes that grew fat and red in summer, the herbs that filled the kitchen with fragrance. She did not know if was listening. She did not even know if the girl could understand her language. But she talked anyway, painting pictures with words, offering memories instead of demands. When her voice grew tired, she stood to leave. She glanced at the doorway as she always did, expecting to see sitting motionless on the bed as always. The nutrient packet she had left that morning was empty. His heart jumped. She had been leaving those packets for days and had never touched them. The girl had barely eaten anything since arriving at the station, but tonight she had eaten. Movement caught eye. Was standing at the doorway just a few steps inside the room, watching with those large silver eyes. Her face showed no expression. Her antennae lay flat against her head, but she was standing. She was looking. She was present in a way she had not been before. Did not speak. She did not want to break whatever fragile moment this was. She simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and then turned and walked away. She could feel a gaze on her back as she went. That night lay in her quarters and stared at the ceiling and allowed herself to feel something that might have been hope. The transfer was still scheduled. Administrator had not changed his mind. She had only 3 days left before would be taken away to a facility where no one would sit outside her door and talk about oceans and rain. But had stood up, had watched her leave. 3 days was not much time. But humans had done remarkable things in 3 days before. They had performed surgeries that should have been impossible. They had pulled survivors from disasters that should have killed everyone. They had refused to give up when every logical calculation said they should. Was not going to stop now. She had 3 days to prove that was worth fighting for. She intended to use every single hour. The alien girl stood alone, until a human gave her a reason to smile. Part 3. Administrator called to his office on the morning of the 6th day. He sat behind his desk with his pale fingers pressed together, his unblinking eyes fixed on her face. He told her that the transfer ship would arrive in 48 hours. The child would be aboard it when it left. Asked for one chance. Just one. She wanted to take to the observation deck on the upper level of the station. Were known to find comfort in open spaces, in the sight of stars stretching endlessly in all directions. If showed any improvement, any sign of recovery, the transfer could be reconsidered. Was silent for a long moment. Then he agreed, but only because denying the request would require paperwork explaining why, and paperwork was inefficient. Thanked him and left before he could change his mind. Getting clearance for a refugee to visit the observation deck was not simple. The upper levels were restricted, reserved for station personnel and diplomatic visitors. Danny Vance spent most of the afternoon helping navigate the forms and approvals, grumbling the entire time about humans and their inability to leave lost causes alone. But he helped. That was the thing about Danny. He complained, but he always helped. By evening, had a temporary pass that would allow her to bring to the observation deck for 1 hour. She walked to the housing block with the pass clutched in her hand, and her heart beating hard in her chest. Was sitting on her bed when arrived, the soft blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up when appeared in the doorway. Her antennae twitched slightly, a movement so small that most beings would have missed it. Crouched down and spoke softly. She told she wanted to show her something beautiful. She promised she would stay close the entire time. She would not force anything. If wanted to leave, they would leave immediately. Did not respond with words, but after a moment she stood up. She kept the blanket around her shoulders and walked slowly toward, stopping just out of arm's reach. It was enough. They walked through the station together, leading the way through corridors crowded with refugees and workers and the endless machinery that kept Waypoint 11 functioning. Stayed close behind her, moving like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the metal floor. The observation deck was empty when they arrived. The large curved windows showed the universe in all its vastness, stars scattered across the darkness like scattered diamonds, distant nebulas glowing with colors that had no names in any language new. A planet hung in the lower corner of the view, brown and barren, but still beautiful in its way. Stopped at the threshold. Her silver eyes went wide, reflecting the starlight, and her antennae rose for the first time since had known her. The girl's whole body seemed to tense, overwhelmed by the sudden immensity of what she was seeing. Did not push. She walked to the center of the deck and sat down on the cold floor, her legs crossed, her posture relaxed. She looked out at the stars and waited. Minutes passed, 5, 10, 15. Then moved. She walked slowly across the deck, her eyes never leaving the windows, and sat down beside. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to share the same space, to breathe the same recycled air, to witness the same impossible beauty. Her antennae began to glow. It was faint at first, barely visible, but recognized it from the cultural briefing she had studied. Antennae glowed when their empathic senses were active, was opening up, allowing herself to feel again after days of protective numbness. The glow brightened and then made a sound. It was small and broken, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. She spoke her first word. Hurts. Turned to look at her. His face was twisted with pain, her small hands pressed against her chest as if trying to hold something inside. Her antennae were fully extended now, drinking in the emotional atmosphere of the station, feeling all the fear and grief and despair of thousands of refugees at once. Understood, had closed herself off to survive, and now that she was opening again, the weight of all that suffering was crushing her. Did not tell her to shut it out. She did not offer empty comfort or meaningless reassurance. Instead, she made a suggestion. She asked to focus on just one feeling, just one, hers. Thought about calm. She thought about safety. She thought about warmth and protection and the fierce tenderness she felt for this small, broken child who had lost everything. She held those feelings in her mind as strongly as she could, like a candle burning in a dark room. Santini turned toward her. The girl's silver eyes met brown ones. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then his expression changed. The pain eased, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. She whispered that human emotions felt different, louder, warmer, like a fire instead of a cold wind. Smiled and told her that humans felt things strongly. It was both their greatest weakness and their greatest strength. A voice came from behind them. The merchant stood in the doorway. He had followed them, curious despite himself. His gray face showed shock as he stared at its glowing antennae. He said he had never seen a closed open again. He had never believed it was possible. Did not take her eyes off. She said that humans specialized in impossible things. Reached out slowly, hesitantly, and touched his hand. Her small blue fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. It was the first physical contact she had initiated since her family died. Held her hand gently and did not let go. Outside the windows, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small miracle happening on the observation deck of a crowded refugee station. But miracles did not need the universe to notice them. They only needed someone willing to believe they were possible. The alien girl stood alone until a human gave her a reason to smile. Part 4. 2 days after the observation deck, everything changed. Was improving. She still did not speak often, but she responded when talked to her. She ate without being prompted. She even walked through the station corridors sometimes, staying close to her side, her antennae gently glowing as she carefully sampled the emotions around her. The medical staff had noticed the change and updated her status. The transfer had been postponed indefinitely. Allowed herself to feel relief. She had fought for this child and she had won. Now she just needed to help heal, one small step at a time. Then they arrived. The diplomatic ship docked at waypoint 11 without warning, its sleek black hull marked with the symbol of the Dominion. A delegation of 3 officials disembarked and demanded an immediate meeting with Administrator. They carried data tablets and official documents, and the cold confidence of a species that had conquered a dozen worlds in the past decade. Learned about the meeting from Danny, who had heard from a friend in the administrative office. The claim that certain refugees on the station were not innocent civilians, but enemy combatants who had committed crimes against the Dominion. They demanded extradition. Among the names on their list was. The accusation was absurd. Was a child, barely 8 years old, but they claimed her family had been resistance fighters who stole classified military technology before their deaths. They claimed the child might have information about where the stolen data was hidden. They wanted her handed over for questioning. Went straight to Administrator's office. She found him sitting behind his desk, looking more tired than she had ever seen him. The delegation had just left, and their demands still hung in the air like poison. Told that his hands were tied. The station needed cooperation to maintain safe passage through nearby systems. Refusing their extradition request could have consequences for everyone at waypoint 11. Asked him if he was really going to hand a traumatized child over to the species that had killed her family. Did not answer. His silence was answer enough. Commander Grant found in the corridor outside the administrator's office. Grant was a human military officer assigned to station security, a woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. She had been watching the situation since the beginning, keeping her distance but paying attention. Grant told that she did not like the story. The timing was suspicious. The evidence they had provided was thin. Something about their demands felt wrong. Asked if Grant could help. Grant said she could delay, but not refuse. She could request additional verification of the claims, demand more evidence before any extradition took place. It would buy time, but not much. Took whatever she could get. That evening, she went to his room and found the girl sitting on her bed with the blanket wrapped around her. Antennae were pressed flat against her head, a sign of fear. She already knew something was wrong. She could feel the tension spreading through the station like a disease. Sat beside her and explained what was happening. She did not hide the truth or soften it with pretty words. Deserved honesty, even when honesty was painful. Listened without speaking. Then she reached out and took his hand. Her small fingers gripped tightly and her antennae touched the skin. Gasped. Images flooded her mind, memories that were not her own. She saw his parents, tall and kind-faced, wearing the simple clothes of medical workers. She saw them in a hospital on their home world, treating wounded patients from both sides of the conflict. She saw soldiers arrive and demand that the doctors hand over the resistance fighters they were healing. She saw his mother refuse. She saw her father stand beside his wife, knowing what the refusal would cost. She saw them die. The memory ended and found herself breathing hard with tears running down her face. Could share emotional imprints through touch, had shown her the truth. Her parents had not been resistance fighters. They had been doctors who refused to betray their patients. They had killed them for it and were now lying to cover their crime. Wiped her eyes and made a promise. She told that no one would take her, not anyone. She went straight to Commander Grant and shared what she had learned. Grant listened with her jaw tight and her hands clenched. She was a soldier who had followed orders her entire career, but there were some orders she could not follow. She told to keep hidden. She would handle the rest. The next morning, the envoy delivered an ultimatum. They wanted the child handed over by Station Dawn, approximately 12 hours away. If the station refused, they would consider it an act of hostility and respond accordingly. Other refugees heard the threat and grew nervous. They had all fled aggression once already. They did not want to face it again, not over one child. Some of them went to Administrator and urged him to cooperate. One child was a small price to pay for safety. Stood outside's door and listened to the voices calling for surrender. She did not move. She would not move. Humans did not abandon their own, and was hers now, whether the galaxy understood it or not. The alien girl stood alone, until a human gave her a reason to smile. Part 5. The patrol ship arrived at Station Dawn. It was smaller than their diplomatic vessel but bristled with weapons, a clear message about what would happen if their demands were refused. The ship requested docking clearance. An administrator, his face pale and his hands trembling, prepared to grant it. Commander Grant stepped in front of the docking bay controls. She wore her full military uniform, the medals on her chest gleaming under the station lights. Behind her stood a dozen members of her security team, humans and others who had chosen to follow her despite the risk. They carried weapons openly, another message, this one aimed at anyone who thought they could simply take what they wanted. Demanded to know what she was doing. Grant's voice was calm and steady. She announced that the child named had been granted provisional asylum under Earth's refugee protection laws. This protection extended to any location where humans had jurisdiction, including this security sector of Waypoint 11. Any attempt to remove the child by force would be considered an act of aggression against a human protectorate and would be responded to accordingly. The ship demanded clarification. Earth was a minor power, a single world with limited influence. Did the humans really intend to start a conflict over one worthless child? Grant smiled without warmth. She said that Earth had a long history of starting conflicts over children. They were welcome to test how far humans would go to protect their own. The docking bay fell silent. Everyone waited. Movement came from an unexpected direction. The merchant walked forward and stood beside the human security team. His gray face was hard with determination. He had lost his ship and his crew to raiders. He had nothing left except his own 2 hands. But he offered those hands now, standing with the humans against the species that had destroyed his life. Others followed. A group of young males who had been students before the war. An elderly couple who had survived the destruction of their home world. A family who had watched recovery with wonder and hope. One by one, refugees who had spent weeks in fear and despair stepped forward and stood with the humans. The envoy's voice came over the communication system, demanding that the station bring order to this chaos. Administrator stood frozen, unable to speak, watching his carefully managed station spiral beyond his control. Then appeared. Walked beside her, one hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. Was trembling, her antennae flat with fear, but she walked forward anyway. She had spent days running and hiding and closing herself off from the universe. She was done running. She stopped in the center of the docking bay, surrounded by humans and aliens who had chosen to protect her. Her antennae rose slowly, beginning to glow with soft blue light. And she shared. The memory poured out of her, broadcast to every empathic and telepathic being in the area. Her parents refusing to betray their patients, the soldiers raising their weapons, the screams, the fire, the moment when watched her mother and father die for doing the right thing. Beings who could receive the projection gasped and wept, and turned to stare at the ship with new understanding. Those who could not receive it directly saw the reactions of those who could, and understood that something terrible had been revealed. The truth spread through the crowd like ripples in water. They had murdered innocent doctors and were now lying to cover their crime. They had come to silence the only witness, a child who had already lost everything. The envoy fell silent. The patrol ship's weapons remained powered but did not fire. Commander Grant spoke into the silence. She said that every being on this station now knew what they had done. This knowledge would spread. It would reach other stations, other worlds, other governments. They could start a fight here today, but they could not stop the truth from traveling. The choice was theirs. Long seconds passed. Then the patrol ship powered down its weapons and requested permission to undock. The envoy's voice, stripped of its earlier confidence, announced that the Dominion would reconsider its extradition request in light of new information. They retreated, knelt beside as the tension in the docking bay slowly released. The girl was exhausted, her whole body shaking from the effort of sharing her memories, but her eyes were clear, more present than they had ever been. She whispered that she was tired, gathered her up gently and carried her away from the crowd. Grant fell into step beside them, already planning their next move. She had contacts on a human colony world, a place where could receive proper care and build a new life. She could arrange transport if was willing to serve as the child's guardian. Did not hesitate, she said yes. 3 days later, they boarded a ship bound for Earth's colony at New Geneva. The vessel was small but comfortable, with large windows that showed the stars. Found a seat near the observation port and settled beside her. The girl pressed her face against the glass, watching the station shrink behind them. Her antennae glowed softly, sampling the emotions of the crew and passengers, finding calm and hope instead of fear and despair. She asked if Earth really had oceans. Smiled and said yes. She promised to show someday. The waves rolling in and out, the smell of salt water, the sound of seabirds calling over the surf. All of it, every beautiful thing that humans had built and grown and protected. Was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to look at with those large silver eyes. And for the first time since her family died, she smiled. Other species would later ask what made humans so willing to fight for a child they barely knew. Why they risked conflict and consequences for a single small life that had no strategic value, no political importance, no logical reason to protect. The answer was simple. Humans did not need reasons to protect the innocent. They only needed the chance. Had given them that chance by surviving long enough to be found. Had given her a reason to keep surviving. And together, they flew toward a future that neither of them had expected, but both of them deserved.